Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks again for being here today. If you're unsure of what's going on the rest of the day, just check the program you got in your goodie bag. Also, if you see the people out front in registration or the people that are wearing these blue shirts, please thank them, because it is because of them that this event is put on. We're all volunteers. Nobody gets paid. All this is done in everybody's free time. So when you see those people, please shake their hands and thank them. Our next last event for Tuesday is the HetNet Forum panel, hosted by Tracy Ford from WIA.
Hi, thank you. I thought I would start out by just telling you a little bit about the HetNet Forum in case it's something you're not familiar with, and for those of you who are very familiar with it, bear with me. The HetNet Forum is a membership body within WIA that is focused on the heterogeneous network. We started out in 2006 as the DAS Forum and changed our name to the HetNet Forum in about 2013 because our members were doing everything. They were doing towers and small cells and DAS and licensed spectrum and unlicensed spectrum, and it really was that aha moment that it was going to be a heterogeneous network that was going to build 4G and going into 5G even more. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists. Right next to me is Ed Myers. Those people on this side can't see, but Ed is Regional Vice President of Sales and Marketing for ShyTech Communications. And next to him, I have Mike Pugliato. Mike develops global strategies for Porting's One solution. And then at the end is Robert Long. He is Director of Sales, Small Cell and Fiber Solutions at Crown Castle. So we chose to be anti-slide and hope this is an interactive panel. And if you guys have any questions that you want to ask, we'll save time at the end. But if you have something that you want to ask right now, just let me know and we'll go. We'll be spontaneous. So to start out, again, this is, the HetNet covers indoor space, it covers outdoor space, it's popular today, there's a lot of talk about going into 5G, what's going to happen, and so I want to start out with the last year, a lot has changed, and all 4 carriers launched unlimited data plans, which it seems like several carriers had used that as a competitive advantage, and then others have resisted it, but now they all 4 have competitive unlimited plans if you're willing to pay for it. So I'm wondering what changes you have seen, starting out maybe in the outdoor space and then going to the indoor space.
What we've seen as the carriers have continued to grow their networks, and the networks have continued to evolve to better account for the capacity and the usage of cell phones over their wireless networks. The need for shared infrastructure has also increased, sometimes exponentially depending on the area. So we're finding that folks are obviously at the towers, upgrading the towers to accommodate the additional traffic. They're building denser networks through the use of small cells and fiber solutions to create more nodes and more access points to grab that traffic and move it more efficiently across their network to take advantage of the spectrum that is available. So from an infrastructure perspective, I think the end result is the need for more shareable infrastructure.
Just a quick comment. I think that the answer is yeah, absolutely. That bandwidth is consumption is growing. It's growing exponentially, and a lot of this has to do. Part of it is being enabled by unlimited plans, but it's also the shift toward mobility. And what I mean by that is that when you consider inside the building the LAN, the LAN is now more or less wireless, and it's a mobile, connected world that we live in. And I think one of the buzzwords now is really about mobility. It's being connected and being able to conduct business, to stay in touch with friends and family, to entertain, as well as remain safe. And so, because of the number of applications, the number of things that we're doing, and it's all happening on our smartphones, yeah, absolutely, bandwidth consumption is increasing, and will continue.
Can you, to follow up on that, Corning and Verizon launched a huge initiative with each other. Is that related to 4G or is that more 5G future looking forward?
Well, it's both, but that particular announcement, and Tracy's talking about last May, that Corning and Verizon announced a $1+ billion deal in which Verizon's purchasing fiber. Back at the VZ Tough conference in January, Mike Haberman made the joke that that's enough fiber to go from Earth and Mars back and forth. It's a lot of fiber. Fiber is going to be imperative in order to deliver the bandwidth to fulfill the promise of fiber-like speeds for wirelessly for 5G.
So in our perspective, we're indoor guys, right? So we actually wind up working with the real estate owners and the enterprises to get distributed antenna systems, indoor small cells deployed, and things like that. So what we've seen, I don't know if it's wholly related to the unlimited plans. My family has an unlimited plan because we couldn't keep paying the overages. But 3 teenagers. It's not much fun. What we've seen with these guys is, and it's going to sound weird, but they actually have come around to a willingness to allow other people to pay for the in-building infrastructure. Which you would think that would be kind of a logical conclusion. That's not necessarily what they've done. So they are very willing now to allow someone else to build out a distributed antenna system, and then they come and join it. T-Mobile has a program called BYOC, where they bring their own connectivity to adapt, right? The AT&T and Verizon guys have actually kind of come around to the fact that they might even allow someone else to fund a baseband and radio system. Doesn't mean that they're going to allow someone else to operate that baseband radio system, but they'll allow someone else to pay for it. Which, again, you would think would be logical if someone wasn't going to, would be willing to fund a baseband radio system, they would allow that. But they historically have not. But they have come around to that. And that's primarily because I think what they've decided to focus on, certainly related to 5G, is if we can spend our capital on building out and enhancing and fortifying the outdoor macro networks and allow someone else to fund the infrastructure portion and then they just bring the signal for the indoor, that seems to make sense and be a better use of their capital when it comes to 5G deployment.
If I could, Tracy, just add to that, part of this also has to do with the fact that the in-building wireless industry is focused on large public venues for a good period of time. I got my start in the DAS industry in 2004, and we were enabling cellular coverage for large public venues, convention centers, stadiums, airports, metros, things like that. And in certain ways, yeah, I absolutely agree with Ed, that the operators have pivoted to spend their capital on building out 5G. At the same time, they've reached a certain saturation level of venues that they care to enable cellular in. Most of those stadiums, most of those airports have some sort of cellular enhancement coverage systems deployed. Now, they may be upgrading them based upon frequency bands and capacity requirements, but a lot of that is informed by the fact that it's done. The venues that they care to enable coverage in, they've been addressed.
And so we agree there's a funding shift. The carriers are less inclined to pay for indoor coverage unless it's a premier NFL stadium type building or city that they tend to build out ahead of a Super Bowl and that kind of thing. So what are the available funding models that the carriers have to pay for? Because that seems to have switched dramatically in the last couple of years.
Guess that was me. There's a couple of obvious funding models here. If the carrier is unwilling, obviously it falls to the building owner, and it falls to the building owner and his tenants a lot of times. There are some shifting HetNet related models for different protocols, CBRS, LAA, which allow for some consolidation of spectrum, some reuse of spectrum, as well as some private LTE networks that will allow a building owner to capitalize a project and realize a return on that investment based on maybe a CAM charge that they can charge back to their tenant. If it's a hotel, maybe there's a per night key charge for additional technology services that they can start to recoup or at least see some type of return on investment for a self-funding model. The other, go ahead, sorry.
A CAM charge is a common area maintenance charge inside a building?
That's right.
Just, you didn't know.
Sorry, yeah.
Acronyms.
Yeah. There's a couple of models that they start to look at for the return on the investment there. And the other thing that they're starting to do, we're starting to work with designers and architects and developers. So as hotels get constructed, they're constructed with the proper chaseways for fiber. They're constructed with the right size distributed antenna service room if the DAS is going to go in with the proper ventilation. So there's ways that we can save capital up front by planning during a remodel or some type of building facelift or a new construction project. So a lot of times these days it's a line item now because of requirements for public safety, requirements for communication throughout the building where there are people and sometimes where there are no people. They've got regulatory compliance issues. So they can fund it to begin with as part of an overall capital contribution to the project. One, because it's a requirement, and two, because they can realize the return on investment.
You know, we're talking about funding the internal or the venue type systems, but it's a pretty similar model in the outdoor space as well. Obviously the players are a little bit different, but as these networks become more dense and the investment becomes much greater to deploy small cell solutions in the public right away to support 5G and the other initiatives, funding is always a big part of that conversation. And I think, you know, companies that are successful in this space are companies that can maintain a low cost of capital, have a stable balance sheet, and are able to invest a significant amount of money to help develop the fiber and the small cell network and not pass all that cost on to the first tenant. And that's why it's important, I think, to create shareable infrastructure, whether it's in the indoor space or the outdoor space. That's really the best use of everyone's capital in this space.
Tracy, I just had 2 quick points. Number one is that the best way to plan for the future is to architect an infrastructure that will scale for future needs. There are many buildings that you will deploy an infrastructure without cellular enhancement on day number 1, but if you've pulled the fiber, pulled the cable, to be able to support those various outcomes. And Ed had mentioned public safety as an example. Increasingly, of course, in order to get your certificate of occupancy, you need to have some sort of public safety compliance. That's a good time if you're doing a greenfield, a brand new build, or doing a major renovation of the building, where you can pull those extra structured cable to be able to pivot and be able to comply with future requirements and needs. The other point that I'd make very briefly is that what's exciting is that we only change or do things because of pain. And so pain is if you're unable to lease a building or something like that, that's lost revenues, that's pain. And so pain is creating opportunities to develop new products and solutions to the toolkit to enable cellular enhancement. And it's also creating new business models in order to get these things funded in order to enable, say, cellular, or just call it wireless, or let's call it mobility inside the building.
So is that, we've done a couple of white papers at the HetNet Forum that talk about the need for planning at the architectural design phase and such. But in that paper, I think it's 2 years old, but it seemed like building owners didn't quite understand that at the time. Are they getting it? Are they realizing that part of this is their responsibility in the indoor space?
Yeah, they're coming to terms with it. They, for the longest time, our industry did a really good job of creating revenue streams for rooftops and things like that for those guys. So they're used to having a handout and saying, oh, yeah, carrier's coming in, I'm going to make a little bit of money here. That is not the case, obviously, with somebody's 300,000 square foot building that's in Franklin, Tennessee. That's the building that that guy owns, but not necessarily one that's going to pass the financial litmus test that the carrier has for spending 100 to 300 grand to come and provide signal to that building. So yeah, they're starting to come around to it. They can realize some additional rent because of enhanced cellular service. And quite honestly, if my cell phone doesn't work where I'm going to rent 10,000 square feet of office space, but it works across the street, where do you think I'm going to go? Will I pay an extra $1 a square foot for it? Yeah, I probably will, because I won't have to buy a phone system or something like that. So, yeah, we're seeing that. I don't know if everybody has done some work with, kind of these work lifestyle companies like WeWork or something like that. Those guys are all about infrastructure, right? When they are going in, they're just doing a couple of floors in a building somewhere. They're going to put fiber everywhere that they can put it. They're going to put Wi-Fi. They're going to do shared services on the land that people pay for. And their clientele are people under the age of 40 with 10 people or less in business for a particular location. There's no phone system that's going to be part of that. Cellular's got to work in those locations, otherwise the tenancy won't be there to pay for the building. So they're really seeing, the obvious need for it, just a way to keep it working.
One other comment is in a lot of ways, venue owners have been conditioned by the ecosystem. Most of the time, the operators, and in some cases, other third-party owners, that they don't have to pay. And so, remember, just a few short years ago, AT&T was owning and operating and building out in-building wireless networks, and they were funding it. So there's been a bit of conditioning in the marketplace. I remember a couple years ago going to a conference focused on higher education, and the pitch is that you don't have to pay for it, and you can actually generate revenue off of these networks. And so some of it has to do with conditioning of the marketplace, and I think venue owners are beginning to understand that sort of the quote-unquote free ride doesn't exist anymore. But I go back to my pain statement. You don't pull out your wallet and spread a check unless there's pain, and I don't observe at this point yet. And there are some outlier markets, perhaps, that I don't see tenants not signing leases because there's no cellular enhancement. Ian Gillett, who's an industry analyst, calls it a building has to be a building first. And what he means by that is that in commercial real estate, often it's still about location. It's about presentation, the fancy marble foyers and stuff like that, and amenities like parking or an on-site gym or a cafeteria. And it's that second tier is connectivity. And it'll be interesting to see how quickly the market evolves and that the pain becomes present for a venue owner to be compelled to make the investment, or at least share in part of the investment.
Switching to the outdoor space first, and I also have the same question for indoors. Several years ago, there was a lot of DAS is dead, small cells are the answer to everything, and that argument seems to have died down a little bit, but I'm wondering what you're seeing in the outdoor space. Are you still building both DAS and small cells?
Yeah, there's still some DAS systems out in the public right away, and those continue to be supported. I would say a lion's share, a vast majority of the new deployments are small cell technology, and I'm using the term small cell generically like a sales guy without a technical background would use it. Pretty much anything that's not DAS and lower power. But we do see a lot of those being deployed, and even some of the legacy DAS networks that have been deployed in the public right away, carriers are now coming back around and upgrading those to small cell technology.
And you and I were discussing, because my question was small cell technology, as I understand it right now, just is, Verizon's small cell technology is Verizon's Sprint's, never the two shall touch. But you were saying you can do shared infrastructure on a pole.
Oh yeah, and that's our model. That's kind of one of the points I was making earlier. I think in order for the 5G deployments and any future deployment to be successful, you need shared infrastructure to support that. It's just financially it becomes too burdensome for someone to go it alone. So the carriers will still generally own their own radios. The shared infrastructure comes from the fiber that's connecting the small cell nodes. the rights that you have to utility poles for a registered utility and the jurisdictions that we operate in, so we have access to the poles. The antenna is often shared. Some folks are deploying integrated antennas, so they'll own their antenna in that particular case. The shrouds, anything that can be shared by more than one user, we're going to own and control, and that helps us sort of spread that cost over a longer period of time and give folks a chance to recover their returns on investment.
What about the DAS versus small cell argument in the indoor space?
So the carriers have standards. We heard some of the Easy Tough this year from Verizon. AT&T had a meeting on standardization inside buildings for DAS deployment in Dallas about a month ago now. Their preference is to do what they call DRAN, right? Distributed radio access networks inside. Right? They would prefer to do small cell inside over a DAS. DAS has some challenges, obviously, with power sharing and some other things that need to be balanced appropriately, and it gets expensive if you're using multiple bands. So they would prefer to do DRAN. In fact, what we're seeing now is on the shared infrastructure side, we can do what they call a neutral host DRAN, and that allows Sprint to bring in their small cells, AT&T bring in their small cells, combine those signals, and bring those over a passive antenna system to distribute signal uniquely for each one of those carriers throughout a building, throughout a venue. So they get the same kind of performance grade that they're looking for, carrier grade performance out of a small cell that's as close as they could possibly get to the end customer, which is good. And it integrates very nicely to their macro network. One thing that we are seeing is that depending on the venue, they would prefer that, but they might not be willing to fund it, right? So they have all come up with programs now that allow owners to go ahead and fund their small cell purchase for indoor. Now, this is unique for indoor, it's not necessarily an outdoor macro network thing. So it allows the funding to come from a third-party source. It gets deployed and integrated just like it would normally get deployed and integrated, but it's actually a small cell inside rather than a small cell driving DAS.
Who owns the equipment?
Depends on the model. Sometimes, in cases like us, with our distribution agreements with Nokia and Ericsson, we wind up continuing to hold title to the equipment because we purchase it and then we license it. We license it to the venue owner and then give a light ownership right to the carrier to use it however they would see fit. Because obviously it's an edge piece of equipment for them and they integrate it just like they would integrate an outdoor small cell. So that's one model. The other models that I think some people are probably a little bit more familiar with are where the carrier will actually has their own program which allows the venue owner to go ahead and purchase it directly in terms of the funding piece, and then the carrier winds up holding title to it and managing that piece.
I would just add, the DAS versus small cell debate is kind of silly. It's kind of akin to the, who do you like, the Beatles or the Stones? Well, why not both? And why not Jimmy and Janis as well? Particularly as we get 29, just like you. So, one of the things that, one of the industry buzzwords of late has been convergence. And convergence can take on multiple meanings. And, one of the advantages or, one of the appeals of, say, small cells, and this has really been cited by the operators, is the operators are looking for alternative approaches and alternative technologies to enable cellular enhancement. That's code for cheaper. But there is a place, there's a role for DAS, there's a role for small cells. Increasingly, we're seeing as we get into the venues where an operator is not going to fund an expensive base station to bring a signal source into the building, using alternative signal sources like small cells. You've heard C-RAN, V-RAN. At Mobile World Congress, we have now O-RAN, Open RAN, as a platform. And so you're seeing these hybrid systems where small cells can feed a DAS head end, and a DAS does what it does best with distributing the signal, particularly in venues where you need multiple operator coverage. But then you layer in some additional technologies, and I don't want to jump too far ahead in the program, Tracy, but you've got licensed and unlicensed spectrum models. And so, as I said in a couple of comments earlier, that the toolkit's expanded. And so, yeah, it's the Beatles and the Stones and Janis and Jimmy.
And to touch on that, the HetNet still means towers and rooftops, and I know that this is more of a small cell panel, but Robert, you're still seeing growth in those areas as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We always say thank God for towers, right? Because all this other stuff that we're doing wouldn't be possible without the tower business. And really we see, and someone mentioned it earlier in one of their presentations, our small cells are a threat to the tower business, and really it's quite the opposite. It's more of a complement to the tower business. And in fact, when you're in a position to combine a lot of different solutions, towers, rooftops, small cells, fibers, etc., it allows you to do some things for the carrier customers that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. You can tie all those solutions together, put something together that's really more valuable than just one of those by itself as the carriers are trying to piece together their solutions.
I read an article recently that estimated that with the bringing in of 5G, the emergence of 5G, is that it'll usher in a 100-fold increase in the amount of bandwidth consumed. So how are you going to support that with 5G? Given that the signals aren't going to travel as far, and that it's that whole densification. You need to get the signal closer to where the users are. And the statistic that I read as an counter to that was that you're going to need to deploy 20 to 50 times more small cells at the edge, closer to where the users are. And so that would certainly be a boon to organizations like Crown and others like them.
We didn't rehearse that ahead of time either.
It's just a part of it.
And actually, the WIA's Innovation and Technology Council, which looks toward the future, not from a policy side at all, but just from an educational and outreach side. And so I'm plugging that right now because we did a lot of hard work on it. We had, Meg, I think you participated on the one that was for densification in the middle prize, and it definitely said that as, I think it was a vertical bridge study, that as they saw more towers and as they saw more densification, they still saw the need for more towers. So, towers and rooftops are not going away anytime soon. And I did download the statistic that I wanted to say so I can say it correctly. So with 5G, with fast 5G, they're looking, the specification, whether we get there or not, but the specification is 1 million devices per square kilometer. So obviously a lot of that is going to be sensor networks and those kinds of things, but still 1 million devices and being able to handle that per square kilometer is a pretty big lift and a lot of connectivity. So with that, let's jump into 5G. The future of 5G, where do you see 5G rolled out? Is that going to, there's a lot of talk about fixed wireless initially, urban areas, maybe rural areas. Does anyone have any insights into that?
I think you're going to see 5G start off mostly in densely populated areas where you have a lot of users. And there's a lot of components to 5G, and there's a lot of folks a lot smarter than me that spend days debating even what 5G is. So I think more to be determined in exactly what 5G is and what it will be able to deliver. The one thing, though, from our perspective that will be required is the need for more infrastructure. So when we start looking at some of these designs in the public right-of-way in major metropolitan areas, the number of small cell or the number of locations is even greater than what we're seeing in the small cell side. So to the points that several folks have made, and it's good for the entire industry, it's going to be more dense, it's going to become more complicated to manage, it's going to become expensive. So those are all the things that we want to figure out how to tie together.
Mobile broadband is obviously the first application, right, for 5G. So yeah, it makes sense that it's going to be in dense and populated areas first. What we're seeing on the indoor side is all the applications, right? So this is the true HetNet and the 5G kind of complementary technology to what's going on inside buildings. So, you know, watering systems inside of suburban office parks associated with, you know, what can we do to monitor and maintain the HVAC system? How does public safety fit into that? Do we need to send other devices into portions of a building where people don't normally go, so we need coverage there? Is there going to be, you know, giant data sets that need to be moved around over small areas, those kind of things? So we're seeing that on the building owner side. There's a tremendous amount of interest in sensors and how 5G can help to collect, analyze, and mobilize that type of analytical data that they'll have available to another building.
And Mike, that goes back to your earlier comment that you don't need to attach the RF spectrum right away if you just do an installation. So you can, how do you guys see that as running lights and HVAC? And
I guess a couple of things. Our big idea and vision at Corning with our solution for the indoor space is wired once, enable everything. And we believe that by doing that with fiber, you are prepared to deploy an infrastructure that lasts the lifespan of the building. So on day one, you may be enabling the traditional communications stuff like Wi-Fi and building automation. And maybe in year 2, you add smart lighting, and maybe at some point you layer in other applications like cellular enhancement. I think, you know, again, it's build for the future. I return just very briefly to the comments that Robert and Ed made about 5G. I agree very much that 5G will initially be deployed in urban areas, which is obviously a shame for rural areas, which will generally be left behind for a period of time. But we think of and then to Ed's point of, so what does 5G enable, and what's going to take advantage of that? I think there are really 3 things that 5G delivers, and number 1, of course, is fiber-like speeds wirelessly. So you're going to get a whole ton of capacity and bandwidth, and to be able to do things, from 4K or 8K video to other types of applications. The other, of course, is low latency. And I know autonomous cars or autonomous vehicles has not been a bright spot in the industry of late, given the news out of Arizona. But the low latency, which means reduction or minimization of pauses, is going to be really paramount to enabling that whole industry of autonomous vehicles. And then the last one, of course, is narrowband IoT, that multitude of devices that are going to get deployed inside and out, in the indoors and outdoor environments. That's going to be the building block for smart buildings, smart cities, and smart communities.
And to touch on the autonomous vehicle bit, because we had 2 professors talking to a group that we have called the Cities Networks Task Force, and WIA is partnering with the Smart Cities Council to try to help municipalities and that ecosystem understand what the role of wired and wireless infrastructure is going to be. So we had one professor say that, who's studying autonomous vehicles, say that right now when they're looking at autonomous vehicles, by default, the vehicle has to be ignorant of the infrastructure around it and ignorant of other cars around it. It has to be autonomous. And then the other professor said that if we don't have that connectivity at some point, we really miss the big picture of a connected car. So lots of fits and starts there, but I thought it was interesting that right now when they're out there, they're anti-connectivity because it's not there yet. Talk about the role of offload. Seeing more Wi-Fi offload, CBRS is coming into the market. What do you expect that to do in the outdoor and indoor space? Does it work in the outdoor?
Well, in the outdoor space, it's another tool and toolkit of the carriers to use. So, again, they're going to need vertical infrastructure to deploy those types of solutions. They're going to need connectivity, whether it's fiber or wireless with node to node. And that's really our part in that solution right now.
One of the things that has been discussed in the market has equated spectrum to the equivalent of, or the 21st century equivalent to the U.S. highway infrastructure system, after World War II. And I would submit that if with the deployment of 5G and the promise of those three things that we talked about, again, speed, low latency, and narrowband IoT for all those devices, that you still got to connect and backhaul all that stuff. It's still got to go somewhere, to the data centers, to the carrier core. And so I'd submit that backhaul, fiber infrastructure, is about as important, if not more, than the spectrum itself.
It's also, where does the computing actually take place? Where is the storage? Is that at one of the big regional data centers? Is that now pushed out closer to the edge, both the computing and the storage as well? And those are some interesting things to think through as well.
Yeah, there was a for those that, if anybody was at Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, it's the 107,000 of your closest friends from the wireless industry all converge upon Barcelona, and there was a debate that I sat in that talked about just that. What's more important, the core or the edge? No conclusion, but well-made arguments. Yeah.
The indoor space there's an education, obviously, needs to happen at the building owner level. When you start talking about CBRS and prioritize spectrum versus general use spectrum, and you can own all the air inside your building and not outside your building, it gets to be pretty heady for everybody, right? So the discussion really needs to be a financial one with the building owners. It's not necessarily a technology-based discussion with building owners. So if they can figure out a way to make money, they're all ears, and then there needs to be kind of a little industry of consultants that comes in and helps those guys with exactly what needs to be deployed and how much money they're going to make in accordance with that. The other thing that people are kind of forgetting with all this stuff is that your devices have to be able to support all of it, right? So that could be a really quick fix, for folks. If there's CBRS deployed inside of a building, carriers are actually supplying part of the service in that building. Your phone supports CBRS. Maybe there's some Wi-Fi offload in the building if you choose to join it. And then you walk outside and you go onto the macro network. If I said all that to a building owner who's focused on his $900 million building in Times Square, he wouldn't care less. He'd say, I got a billboard outside that generates $30 million a month. What are you going to do for me? Right? So it's a different conversation when you're talking to the indoor guys. As much as we really like technology, it's at odds with real estate sometimes. It's our job to make sure that it translates.
That's really well said. Maybe it's the marketing guy in me, but there's this subtle shift between and difference when engaging the building owners between an expense and an investment. I think what Ed's referring to is the conversation needs to change to a discussion that really proves out the investment of this technology or infrastructure.
I agree. I think that we spent a lot of time discussing, or it seemed to me that when you would say, you can put in a desk for X amount of money, or you can put in the building owners would say, well, I'm just going to do Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi solves everything. And, it doesn't. There's more. You need everything. You need all the tools. So my last question before I open it up is just what are some of the biggest challenges facing the outdoor space and then the indoor space? What do you want to solve if you rule the world for a day?
Well, I like the regulatory discussion earlier. They're spending a lot of time helping us to deploy the solutions. There's certainly a need, so that's not the challenge. You define the need. We know there's a need for more infrastructure in the public right away. We have a business model that works. It's a shared infrastructure model, so not one carrier is burdening 100% of that cost. So really, it comes down to the speed of it. How quickly can you deploy it? Is there an opportunity to reduce the cost? But we simply pass that on and make it easier for the customers to deploy more quickly.
I think, so the question was outdoor and indoor. So I think from the outside perspective, to me it's about spectrum. Anyone that thinks that we've got enough spectrum is sadly miss. We need more spectrum. So one is how does how do we free up more spectrum for operators to deploy these frequency bands and technologies? And number two, for the outdoor spaces, one of the challenges that has plagued, I think, the mass scale deployment of small cells outdoors is real estate, siting, power, backhaul. So, and I would extend that even further to deploying. If we agree that infrastructure, backhaul infrastructure is as important as spectrum, again, it's the siting, it's getting freeing the ability to deploy all that stuff in order to enable communications. I think indoors, and I think Ed's touched on it a number of times here. It's creating the business models that are a win-win-win to the various stakeholders that are involved in enabling communications inside the building or connectivity.
Right. So yeah, on the indoor side, I think there's probably two things that I would love to focus on. The first is that really our customer set is changing. It's not going to be a carrier-supported revenue stream for indoor. Everybody's got to kind of come to terms with that. We need the carriers, obviously, and there needs to be some cooperation for bringing signal in and certainly coordinating backhaul. But the ultimate customer on the indoor building space, at least for where it generates revenue for companies like mine, isn't necessarily the carrier. They are unwilling and unable to continue to capitalize the builds for the $5+ million buildings under the 300,000 square feet in this country, right? So, but the building owners want it, and the tenants seem to have a desire for it as well. The other is simplification. If anybody's ever done any distributed antenna system deployments, there's a lot of moving parts that go along with DAS deployment or indoor small cell deployment. Until it's as easy to put in a distributed antenna system or an indoor broadband system as it is to plug in a Wi-Fi access point, it's going to continue to be a struggle, right, to get everybody on the same page. It's not even so much expense, although things are still pretty expensive. It really has to do with how simple it is and how fast we can get that thing to market. You've got to build out a head-end room that needs 400 square feet. It's got to have 600 amps of electrical service in there if you're doing a real DAS. It's got to have all the conduit and chaseway built so the fiber can get connected from the head-end room to the remotes. And then you got to deploy antennas places that visually aren't going to be impactful to the venue. There's a lot of things to consider. So anything that we can do to simplify that process for the building owner and for the systems integrator that's doing the development, that would be, certainly well received by the real estate community.
I think, Tracy, if I could just add on to Ed's point, two quick observations. Number one is the industry, I think we can do ourselves a favor of getting away from single-purpose, single technologies. When we just think of DAS, you get to the point where you've got these siloed solutions that it gets easier to say no to, particularly when you go and build a building. One of the final considerations is cellular enhancement. So the money's been spent once the building's been built. All of the infrastructure has been put in, and so I think part of this is changing the paradigm to look at sort of multi-purpose infrastructure that supports multiple types of outcomes. And again, we talked about Wi-Fi is a given inside of the building. Cellular is increasingly becoming a requirement, but there's all those other things like cellular enhancement and smart lighting, or building automation and smart lighting and security cameras and stuff. So I think one is changing the paradigm and trying to get away from single-purpose, single technologies. And the other piece is that part of the promise of small cells is Wi-Fi-like deployment simplicity. The same thing with CBRS. CBRS basically creating a private LTE inside of the building. The promise is how do we make it Wi-Fi simple? And certainly the DAS OEMs are innovating like heck in order to make the complicated things easier. And what I mean by that is the design the deployment, the commissioning, the optimization, and the management of that. And that'll happen. I think, we've observed that in certain ways, when going back to the DAS and small cell debate, is that in certain ways DAS is getting smarter and looking a little bit more like small cells, and small cells are trying to look a little bit more like DAS. And that's what the cool thing is and the topic here is appropriate, the title, the HetNet. There is a toolkit, and you're going to use probably many of those tools in order to achieve those outcomes.
Good. We have time for questions if anybody has anything they'd like to ask. Yay.
Question for Robert. Robert, are you seeing any of your customers wanting to install small cells in places where you have existing towers in dense environments?
Yes, so they'll often use the tower location as the hub where they locate all the C-RAN architecture. So you'll have a number of nodes small cell nodes that will home back to that tower. So I can't remember who was doing it, but someone did a video or talked about it a little bit, where someone on the panel having the tower and seeing the small cell in the same view. So that does happen, yes.
Anybody else? Well, with that, please join me in thanking our panelists. And